Hey everybody, welcome to Fat Product Review. If you are liking our content, we would love for you to subscribe. Of course, we love your comments. We love your shares. I'm expecting a lot of comments on this interview. Very excited to have Christy Harrison here with us today. She is the anti-diet dietitian, or one of many, thank God. And she's also an author of a new book called Breaking Free from Diet Culture and Making Peace with what? With something, life?
It's
Food.
actually it's actually anti-diet, reclaim your time, money, well-being, and happiness through intuitive eating. The subtitle is very long. Boop. I'm like in a mirror image here. So.
Christy, can we put a copy of your book in the art for the show for this?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, what inspired you to write that book?
So it was kind of a 10-year journey, honestly, of sort of circling around these ideas, mostly inspired at first by my own relationship with food, my own disordered eating and struggles with body image. And, when I was in college, that's when the disordered eating started. I have always had thin privilege. So I've always managed to not have people interfere in my relationship with food. I grew up as an
Mhm.
intuitive eater and sort of had that privilege and also the privilege of always having enough food to eat, so I didn't have the food insecurity piece interfering with that. So I was able to maintain intuitive eating until I got to about age 20. Then I gained a little bit of weight, and then all of the information that had been instilled in me from diet culture came bubbling to the fore, and I was like, I have to lose weight, I have to figure out how to do this, and went on my first diet, and it really spiraled from there. And when I graduated college, I started my career in journalism. And as a journalist, you have to kind of find a beat. And my beat, naturally, because I was not eating enough and I was obsessed with food, became, food, nutrition, and health. Those were the things that I was staying up all night researching anyway. So I figured might as well make that my career. And so, I was kind of circling around ideas around relationship with food and um, the food environment, food justice, all the Michael Pollan stuff was a really big part of it too in the early days. And so, I was trying to heal my relationship with food as I was like writing my way through it, basically.
We
And
all.
in, yeah. And that was, the first like 6 years of my career or so. And then in 2010, I went back to, or 2009, I went back to school to become a dietitian and get my master's degree and wanted to, unfortunately, at the time, end the O word epidemic. That was my goal. And I was wanting to kind of be the next Michael Pollan and write books, like him. And ended up studying with Marion Nestle at NYU. And, but miraculously through that, even though there was a lot of kind of triggering stuff that came at me in my programs, I also decided to start working on my first book, and that book itself never materialized, but it sort of ended up leading to anti-diet, and it was a cultural history of emotional eating. And I identified with, as an emotional eater at the time, and I was curious, like, where does this concept come from? Have people always been emotional eaters? Is this a particularly like 20th or 21st century phenomenon? What's the deal with emotional eating? And in the process of researching that book, I came across Intuitive Eating by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch. And I also came across a lot of the research by Pallavi and Herman, who have shown that dieting drives binging, and that emotional eating kind of isn't a real concept on its own, separate from dieting. That the restriction of dieting and deprivation um, drives so-called emotional eating, or drives what people identify as emotional eating. And so those two things really shaped the course of my career. Planted seeds for me first in my own recovery and helped me. I brought those ideas into my therapy. I wrestled with them. I worked through the book Intuitive Eating with my therapist. And that was sort of the key to my own starting recovery. But then I was also like starting to work as a dietitian and a nutritionist and, you know, doing the whole thing, right? Towing the party line, telling people what to eat, telling people to eat less, like all of it. And I was seeing people who were like my star clients or my star students in nutrition education classes being eerily similar to how I used to eat in my most restrictive days. And that was kind of the first little light bulb that, like, okay, something is wrong here. I don't think, even though I at the time thought that I needed to be telling larger bodied people to lose weight and that, like, yeah, it's natural that they might eat differently from me. I was like, okay, but why are they having the same kind of reactions and responses and this sort of like extreme, taking it to this place that felt really extreme at the time. And so, naturally my interest sort of started to gravitate towards disordered eating, working to help people heal from disordered eating. And when I started doing an internship and rotations in disordered eating, I started to realize, oh, like intuitive eating and health at every size are really the gold standard of recovery. Isn't it interesting that this thing, intuitive eating, that I've been practicing in my own life, has this application for eating disorder treatment?
Yeah.
And, health at every size had been something that I had heard about. And a friend of mine actually was an editor at Slate magazine, and he is a health at every size person, and was anti writing anything about the O word epidemic. And his editor wanted to have this package on childhood O word, and he was like, I recuse myself, I can't do this, but he tapped me to be a guest editor for that package. And I worked with him, on some stories and stuff that he wrote for it. And so through that process, we kind of wrangled and debated. And, he recommended some books to me: Health at Every Size, Lessons from the Fatosphere, The Fat Studies Reader. Bought them, and they sat on my shelf for a couple of years. I couldn't crack them at the time. But as soon as I started to hear about that in eating disorder treatment, I came back to those books, and I actually sat down and read them. And I actually started to feel like, oh, okay, like this makes a lot of sense. And so that's sort of where the genesis of this book came in, was that, like, once I started to learn about intuitive eating and health at every size, that became the focus of what eventually turned into this book. And so this book is,
Honestly, I'll put links to those other books too in the show notes, along with links to your book. But could you tell everybody, I forgot to ask you this in the beginning, your website, how the easiest way for people to find you, and how they can find you on social media in case they want to follow you?
yeah, thank you so much. So my website is ChristyHarrison.com, ChristyHarrison.com. That's a good hub for all my stuff, the book, the podcast, my writing, etc. I'm also on social media, on Instagram and Twitter, actually, at Christy Harrison, where the first I is a 1, CHR1STY Harrison. And I'm on Facebook as well. I think it's Christy Harrison Nutrition there, but it basically is just a repost of what I post on Instagram. And I have to say, I'm not as active on social media these days because I've been doing a lot of thinking and soul searching about my relationship with it. And I've, over the years, but then I watched the documentary, The Social Dilemma, and it kind of brought together a lot of the issues that I've been seeing with it, and have kind of taken a big step back from social media, and I'm sort of rethinking how I relate to it. So I think the best places to find me are actually now my email newsletter, which you can find at ChristyHarrison.com/email, and on my podcast as well.
Yeah, I forgot to mention your podcast. I love your podcast. And I was telling you before we started recording, I would listen to it when I was driving down to Monterey to go to school for about 8 weeks. And I just was like, oh gosh, this all makes so much sense to me. So appreciate all of your work and all of your knowledge, and that you're so willing to share it with all of us. And as I mentioned to you before we started recording, when I started my channel, one of the first things I was thinking is when I saw your article for Wired about, let me read the title of this article. Has the best headline of all time. I share this article very often, but the title is COVID-19 does not discriminate by body weight. The claim that those with higher BMIs are at special risk of dying from coronavirus is grossly overstated. Oh, fat person here. And I told you I'm going to be a little vulnerable, but I have been scared shitless since COVID-19 happened, mostly because I know, and the words that Reagan Chastain use are, I know whenever I go to see a doctor, I'm going to get subpar treatment. I'm a fat person. I live in a fat body. We already know that the medical field is very biased towards fat people. There are some teeny glimmers of hope that things are getting a tiny little bit better, like the email from Kaiser talking about intuitive eating in the title. I told yesterday, I told Dr. Ordway, I got that email from Kaiser and it was in my inbox 30 seconds before I forwarded it to Reagan. Reagan, Kaiser's talking about intuitive eating. Anyway, back to my fear of COVID. As a fat person, I'm scared shitless to get it. And as things start to calm down and the emergency rooms and the ICUs weren't as full, I felt a little bit more at ease. Like, okay, at least if something does happen, I'm not going to be triaged, pushed out like they do to the elderly and to Black and brown people. I have a lot of privilege in that I have amazing insurance. I'm white, but I'm fat. So there's a good chance I'm going to get pushed down, especially when they're in a triage state like they are again right now. Then I saw your article and I was like, oh God, okay, maybe this is the truth. Maybe we're not getting COVID more often or dying more often because we're fat. And I think that's the pink elephant in the room is like, are fat people getting it more? Are we dying more from it? And I think you have some great data on that, some points to make. And I would love to hear from you about
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so when I wrote that piece back in April, it was really early days. And actually I had like done some PubMed searches as soon as COVID-19 research started coming out to see if there was anything related to, a word, right, to larger body size and COVID. And there was nothing as of like March, 15th or something like that. There were zero results. And then by April, mid-April, when I published that piece, there were, a few studies that had come out, right? Probably, a handful, maybe 30 or so studies on that connection in some way. And only a couple studies that had anything really to say on like, is there a higher risk that we're actually like doing, statistical regression on whether there was a higher risk for people of higher BMI. And of those studies, none of them controlled for things like race, socioeconomic status. None of them controlled for weight stigma, which, no study really ever does, right? And the weight bias care that people received. None of them were controlling for weight cycling, all the stuff that we know has a huge influence on people's well-being and that can explain the excess health risks that we see for other diseases in larger bodied people. And so I was like, okay, it seems like the same pattern is happening here, that these studies are coming out that are just, showing some sort of correlation, not doing a good job of controlling for independent confounding variables, and then making the claim that body size is to blame. This is like diet culture, all over. This is how diet culture operates in situations of new data. And what I found interesting was that, even in the absence of data, like even back in March when there was nothing there about, O word and COVID, the CDC was still saying larger body size was a risk factor, right? It's like, where did they get that? What are they, are they pulling that out of thin air?
but they took it
And
off the website recently, right?
no, so it's back on now. As last I checked it was the other day, yeah. And unfortunately, they've added now, more sort of a larger swath of BMIs to the list. But interesting thing about this data, it's so flawed in so many ways, right? One of the ways in which it is flawed is that, back in mid-March, the CDC labeled larger body size as a risk factor. And so then that influenced care going forward, right? Doctors and hospitals were seeing that, making that assumption. And so if you're looking at like hospitalization rates and you're saying, oh, larger body people have a higher risk of being hospitalized for COVID-19, it's like, well, that's a clinical decision actually, right? Like to hospitalize someone is a clinical decision, and that can be swayed by belief that someone's at higher risk. It can also be swayed by things like, the availability of beds, other subjective factors. There's a lot of reasons that like hospitalization doesn't necessarily tell the whole story of, how severe someone's COVID case really is. But, there's been bias baked in from the beginning with the CDC making this claim. And for the best I could tell, because their press person didn't respond to my request in time for that, piece or really ever. But the best I could tell is that they were extrapolating data from H1N1, the swine flu pandemic, because in that pandemic, and that was 10 years ago, in that pandemic, there's a lot of initial data that again said higher BMI is a risk factor for more severe cases of this disease. But then 5 years later, a meta-analysis came along, systematic review and meta-analysis of all the data that had been published between 2009 and 2011, the years of the pandemic, showing that actually when you control for quality of care, when you control for like how early did people get antiviral treatment, the best available treatment at the time, any difference in severity of cases disappeared for larger bodied people. And so it was really just medical weight bias, right? It was the fact that larger body people were getting worse quality care. Also, there was no difference in mortality rate at all between fat people and thin people. So that's interesting too, right? Because even still, sometimes now researchers are pointing back to that H1N1 data and being like, as with H1N1, we see with COVID-19, blah, 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 risk factor, right?
Yeah.
Not looking at the more recent meta-analysis showing that actually the problem wasn't body size itself, it was weight bias, it was fat phobia in the medical system.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so, we're seeing that play out in so much of this research now where it's all kinds of muddied because, again, there's this assumption that larger body people are at higher risk from the get-go, which is influencing clinical care decisions. The best, available research that I've seen really doesn't show that larger body people are at any higher risk of getting the virus in the first place, of contracting COVID-19. It's only that some research, and again, it's mixed, shows that fat people are more likely to have worse cases of COVID when they get it, but that's measured by things like hospitalization, ICU admission, and intubation, as well as mortality. And again, like ICU admission and intubation, those are clinical decisions, right? Those are decisions made by doctors to escalate someone's case to the next level. They have clinical guidelines, yes, in the hospital for like how to do that or what in what case to do that. But it's also very subjective and case by case. And if you're already being influenced to think heavier people have worse outcomes with this disease, then you're more likely to escalate someone's care
Yeah.
if they're, above a certain BMI, right? So I think it's super problematic. And some of the research that I've seen, the one of the biggest studies that actually has controlled for the greatest amount of confounding variables, it was done in like 10,000 plus people with COVID in the Veterans Administration system, showed no difference in risk for larger bodied people for ICU admission, hospitalization, intubation, or death. And actually for things like, I forget, I think it was like hospitalization, actually heavier people had lower rates of admission, like
Yeah. That's what
statistically
I read.
significantly lower rates, right? So there's some major discrepancy in this data. It's by no means an open and shut case.
Nope.
And yet, of course, the media is making it out to be like, and the CDC and all these health authorities, right? And it's all just sort of feeding on itself, making it out to be this huge risk factor. And fat people everywhere I know are scared
We're
because,
scared. Well,
yeah,
what I've noticed is that once one thing kind of gets put out into the world, people think that it's now common knowledge. And, I have people talking to me all the time about it, oh, Crystal, it's really more dangerous for fat people. I'm like, well, it's actually not. But, once you hear it, it becomes part of the the zeitgeist or whatever. It's just like it becomes like some people, oh no, of course you don't. How would you know, Crystal? I mean, the CDC says this or whatever. And it's like, yeah, as far as I know, there's not one single disease that only affects people of size. Every disease that we get, thin people also get, and every disease thin people get, we also get. Like, there's no, oh, only fatties get this, and that includes COVID so far as we can tell.
exactly. Yeah. I think that the assumption that fatness makes you more at risk of everything or that fatness is to blame for getting certain diseases, right? We see this so much with diabetes and heart
Yes.
disease and things like that. But, I think that stigma is increasingly there with COVID too, right? It's like, oh, you brought it on yourself or whatever. And that's
Oh,
just
your
not
fault.
true.
Oh,
And what's more, even if there were a demonstrated risk, even if researchers were able to control for every confounding factor, including weight stigma and weight bias care, and still found some negligible increased risk for heavier people, well, okay, fine, but there's no known way to shrink larger bodies in a safe and sustainable way.
oh,
Even that tiny percentage, right, that 2 to 5% that does lose weight and keep it off long term, they tend to have some really severe complications from that, right? Disordered eating, a really damaged relationship with food, sometimes physical health complications that come along with that disordered eating, that are very reminiscent of anorexia. And so really anyone who tries to lose weight is going to have problems, and the vast majority of the time it's not going to be effective. And weight cycling, we know, puts people at higher risk of many many diseases that tend to get blamed on weight itself, including
yeah.
heart disease, which is a risk factor for COVID, right? So,
That's
you
your immune
know,
system. It compromises your immune system when you're restricting so much. You're trying to change the way your body looks, right? So there's a lot of complications that come in with the vaccine. What do you know as far as, are they testing the vaccines on fat people?
as far as I know, I think they are, but there's been so many headlines saying, it may not be as effective on fat people. And I just don't know why that is. Is that because, this is something I need to look into more. Like, is it because there are smaller numbers of fat people in the testing pool? Is it because they're not, maybe it's something that would need to be adjusted for body size, right? There's certain medications that, you have to adjust it based on a person's weight to make sure they get the correct dose. Is this one of them? But yeah, it sort of seems like a foregone conclusion that it's like, oh, it might not be as effective on larger people. So you should lose weight, like rather than, oh, so we should figure out a way to make a vaccine that's effective for everyone, because
Like if we
like
are the majority of the
the majority
population,
of the population.
shouldn't they be making vaccines for us first and then hope that it helps thin people? I mean,
Yes.
I don't really mean that, but you know what I mean.
No,
I
totally.
want everybody to be well and healthy and not get this and not get super sick. But I like
Yeah.
this kind of a theme that's going around. I see a few people talking about this. For once, I might be able to be like, because people blame me all the time for glorifying obesity because, it's so great to be fat. When I said that O word. But anyway, I like for once in my life, there might be a perk. I might get to the top of the list of vaccine because I'm a fat person. Like,
Yeah.
woo, finally, I don't ever get into a club for free, but I might get a vaccine, one of the first people to get a vaccine. I don't know if
Yeah.
that's really going to happen or not, but yeah, it's like, I don't know how I even feel about that. I'm going to get the vaccine one day. I know that
Mhm.
will happen eventually, but I just don't know if it's going to be effective for people like me or not.
Yeah, it remains to be seen, I think, but I do think that, getting priority with vaccination could be really helpful. If it is effective, and let's hope it is, right? Let's hope they work their shit out and like make it effective for the majority of the population, because that's the right thing to do. If you're able to get a vaccine and avoid potentially getting COVID and having to go into the healthcare system that is so weight biased, maybe that could be helpful, right? So like, I've been encouraging people to take advantage potentially of this ability to be like earlier in the line, and
Yeah,
um, get the vaccine and take care of yourself, while also recognizing that the science is very much still, shaky. And like that H1N1 meta analysis that I mentioned, that was done 5 years after the initial research started to come out, right, on H1N1. Like, we've got a ways to go until we actually see real research that controls for all these confounding variables. Like, it's probably going to take years to get that real clear picture. And so in the meantime, just understand that the science is very much in flux despite what the media headlines are saying.
absolutely. We don't have much time left, so I just want to end with one thing. People will probably notice that you are not a fat person, right?
Mhm.
So how did you become a thin ally, and how do we get more? And how can we, like, what kind of action item can we give thin people to be like, here's how you can help your fat brothers and sisters? And we all know the things. Well, most of us know how fat bias is kind of rooted in white supremacy, and it's just like patriarchy, and it's so much crap. And for whatever reason, people take thin people more seriously than they take fat people. So we need all of you. So how would you recruit more? And what would you tell them to go out and do for us?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it sucks that people take thin people more seriously, but that is, the reality at this point is like we need to be there to bolster what fat activists have been saying for years, right? And to also, come at it from different angles and the science and all of that to kind of make as many dents as possible in this fat phobic monolith that we're faced with. For me personally, I think the way that I came to, this form of allyship is through my own personal history, right? Like, I really suffered in my relationship with food. I really had severe body dysmorphia and, thought that I was too large, and had this experience of, quote unquote, feeling fat, right? Which I subsequently learned is not really a thing. Like, you can't feel, but I believe myself to be fat. And, I think through that process started to really understand the impact of diet culture and of this belief system on all of us, and how I had internalized these oppressive ideas about body size. And if I had internalized these things as a thin person, and starting to recognize like, oh, I'm not actually fat. Like, I move through the world with privilege. I don't have, the pressures on me to lose weight, and the constant trolling and shaming and bullying that larger body people experience. If I'm experiencing this internalized or like internal sense of fat phobia for
Yeah.
myself, what are my fat friends experiencing? And I've always had fat friends. I think that was, a part of it too, is that I've always known and loved fat people, and, seen them as just like, friends and
Humans?
people and human beings. Yeah. And sort of, understanding what they went through and sort of connecting it to my own struggles of like, oh wow, dieting for me has taken me on this 10-year horrible journey of shame and body loathing and self-hatred and disordered eating. What has it done to my fat friends? What has it done to fat people, all over the world, right? And so just kind of having that empathy, starting from the personal and sort of working outward, was the starting point for me, I think. So I think for thin people in the audience who are maybe curious about this stuff, you probably wouldn't be watching this if you weren't already curious, right? And already interested in sort of showing up for this movement. So I think, doing that work of really looking within and thinking about your own experience and empathizing with fat people who go through that and, 100 times more in the world, right? Because of the weight stigma that's heaped on people of size. And then, in terms of how to show up, right? I think there's so many ways for thin allies to show up and, or practice allyship, right? I've heard, a number of people say that sort of labeling yourself as an ally is not necessarily helpful, because it's not that you're in a static state of allyship. It's that you always have to be practicing, because we all have, internalized fat phobia or internal fat phobia from this culture, right? Not necessarily internalized, because, as a thin person, I'm not internalizing the oppression, but I have, the stuff that I've taken in from diet culture that is fat phobic. And so it's, I think, a constant practice of unearthing that, doing your own psychological work to kind of notice and consider, oh, there's that weird little fat phobic thought. How can I let that go? Right. Yeah. Just these
Bubbles up.
antenna. Yeah. And then, okay, let it go. And it, in terms of sort of active acts of allyship, I guess, thinking about ways that you can speak up for the fat people in your life in various situations, right? If you're at work, let's say, and, you're in a circle in the break room or who knows, we'll be back in that situation, but on Zoom, right? Everybody's talking about their weekend or their Thanksgiving or whatever. And, some other thin person is like, oh, I'm on the keto diet and I'm doing blah, 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 or whatever. Right. And like, I cut out this food group, and you have your, fat friend from work who's in the Zoom, and you're like, oh shit, they're hearing this. Like, you can, say, hey, I'd really appreciate if we don't talk about dieting and weight loss stuff. Like, I find that super problematic. In some cases you can talk about the oppressive roots of it, right? Like the racist roots of diet culture and the fat, give someone a copy of Sabrina Strings' book, like talk about the racial origins of fat phobia. And I think that's a piece as well of allyship to potentially practice, that if you're in circles of progressive minded thinkers who care about social justice issues and want to show up in that way in the world, and are also espousing fat phobic ideas, because unfortunately fat phobic ideas show up in a lot of other social justice spaces. I think that's a point at which you can start to educate gently or offer some resources on, hey, did you know that actually fat shaming and food shaming have really oppressive roots, and that these are, this is a lot of the same stuff we're fighting against in other arenas. We don't want to be oppressing our, comrades of size in this movement. How can we actually make this a safer space for them to engage in, progressive work and thinking?
Great ideas. Thank you for that. I appreciate you. I appreciate all of your work so much. Thank you so much. ChristyHarrison.com, right? Tell us the title of your book again.
It's Anti-Diet. Yep. Reclaim your time, money, well-being, and happiness through intuitive eating. And then because we didn't have enough words on the cover, we added this fun little title, or I don't know what it's called, reading line: why obsessing over what you eat is bad for your health, which is really like my favorite thing on that cover, because I think that's very true.
Yeah, anytime we're obsessing over anything, right, that's usually not going to be good for our health. And yeah, I'm so curious about the money thing too. Sometime we'll have to talk more about that as well. But I really appreciate your time for doing this. I appreciate all your work around this COVID stuff. It's scary for us, and I know a lot of my fat friends feel very vulnerable and very nervous and anxious. And so, thank you for all of your articles.
Thank you. I so appreciate you and this opportunity. And yeah, I'm glad I could help in some small way to ease this time for you.
Thanks, Christy. Take care.
You too. Thanks, Crystal.